Designers that work in Figma waste way too much time exporting and sharing the same design files with different members of their team over and over again. But what if I told you there's a way to never manually export a Figma file again? Because this is something that can be entirely automated. And the best part, you don't even need to be an engineer to set this up. In this video, I'm going to show you how to set up a fully automated Figma asset management system using Make and Airtable. This system will allow you, with just one click of a button in Figma, to push thousands of exports directly into Google Drive. But it doesn't stop there. This system is entirely flexible, whether you need to save your files to Dropbox, Notion, send them to Slack, or even send them as attachments to an email. With this setup, you can export your designs to wherever you need them. So if you're a designer, you're definitely going to want to set up this system for yourself. Or even if you're a marketer working closely with a designer, set this system up for them and I promise they will love you forever. Now, if you're new to the channel, my name is Jan, and at 9X, we're all about AI and automation for business professionals, how you can leverage this to improve the way you work. So if that sounds interesting, make sure to subscribe to the channel. All right, let me show you how this works. So before you go and set up this Figma asset management system for yourself or for your team, I just want to give you a quick demo of how the whole thing works so you can decide if it's also something that'll be worthwhile setting up. So in our case, I have this Figma file here, which is a logo database that our awesome designer Justine has set up. So here we have a bunch of different logos from different SaaS applications, basically different AI and no-code tools that either we've used or we've tested in the past. And we keep this database of logos because we need to use these a lot in, whether it's on our website, in different presentations that we're giving to students, and also in LinkedIn posts that we regularly share. And rather than the old way is us, or we were always annoying Justine, hey, can you send me the Airtable logo? Can you send me the logo for Make? Can you send me the logo for Eventbrite? Here with this, we have everything in one place. These are already set up as components, meaning we can use them within Figma. But what this asset management system does, which is amazing, is we basically, every app logo that is here on the page is synced to an Airtable base. And you can see there, we've got close to 480 assets here that are synced. And not only are they then available in Airtable, but also now they are basically synced to this Google Drive folder, where if I show you also how they look, you can see they're all available. We all basically have Google Drive synced locally on our MacBooks. So now we just need to know we have to go to the app logos folder, and any app logo that has been added to Figma will automatically appear here in the Google Drive, just making this super simple. So to show you how this works in real time, what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually I'm going to put my designer hat on for a moment and add a new logo of a tool that we've just started testing, which is called Gumloop. So I've spared you the pain of watching my terrible design skills, but I've fast forwarded. We've got our Gumloop logo set up in the right structure, similar to our other apps. So all I need to do now is basically turn this one into a component. So you'll notice like all the other apps that we have here are already created as components. So if I head to my Gumloop layer, I just need to, at the top right here, click Create Component. This has now turned this into a component. We see the name is now purple instead of white, the text color. And I get an additional option here, which is to publish. And now as soon as I hit publish, that's what's going to actually trigger the sync. We're leveraging Figma webhooks here. So I hit publish. This will then trigger the sync to Airtable and then also to Google Drive. So let me hit publish. Now over in Airtable, that sync has started. We see we've created a new record here. Right now, this is on the status trigger. You'll notice everything else is on the status complete. What's going to happen in a second, this is going to trigger the second automation now that has disappeared from the trigger status. And if I search here now for Gumloop, we'll see that image has now been added and the status updated to complete. And we can see that Gumloop logo is now accessible in Airtable. And we also have the Google Drive file ID, meaning this one's been successfully pushed to Google Drive. And now if I head over and check in Google Drive, if I sort this one actually by the last modified with the newest on top, and we see that Gumloop logo has also been successfully added to our Google Drive. It's saving us a bunch of time each and every week. We know all our logos are in one place, and literally it's so nice for Justine that she doesn't even need to leave Figma. She can just literally hit that publish button and know that the automation will kick in and automatically export this both to Airtable and Google Drive. Now, before we get into building out this live together, I'm going to walk you through here the different components of this system to also give you a really good overview before we start on the build. So obviously, as I already mentioned, the way that this one starts is with a certain Figma file that has components. So components are the key part here, because without the components feature, you basically don't have access to hit this publish button. So we have a file with Figma components. And then as I mentioned, whenever something changes, you have the ability to publish some changes. And here we're leveraging Figma webhooks, and I'll show you how to set up that specific Figma webhook that's going to listen to any new components that have been published, any new library that has been published. This then triggers a make scenario, and I can just play this video here to show you how efficient this one is. It's literally syncing over almost 500 assets, and it can do it in just 5 operations, because we leverage 2 things. First of all, makes aggregation feature. So we can aggregate all of those components into one CSV and then send that CSV to Airtable using their sync API. So that's what's happening up here. This is basically being then created. You'll notice the different Airtable columns here that have the lightning bolt. These are all synced fields because it's using the Airtable sync API. And then whenever a new component is published, what this is going to do is it's only going to make sure we're not going to re-add 500 rows to Airtable. This is literally going to match 1 for 1 what's the current state of that Figma file and the exact components that are in there. What we then have is we have an additional automation. So all the Airtable sync is doing is listing out these different components. We're not actually downloading or exporting anything yet. What we then do is we go down and we're triggering an Airtable automation, which says whenever the status here is trigger, and that is the default status of any new record, we want to trigger an Airtable automation, which then is triggering a second make scenario here. And what this one is doing is again, leveraging the Figma API and exporting the image. We then download the image, and depending on whether it already exists in Airtable, we will just update the file and update the Airtable. So that handles is if a company's logo changes, we can just re-trigger in Airtable and it will update it. Otherwise, if it's seeing it for the first time, we're gonna here upload it to Google Drive and then update that Airtable record to say, hey, this logo was successfully completed, and also upload the logo to Airtable. And finally, this is obviously pushing that to Google Drive and adding it back here into Airtable. So this is actually the second video in our 2-part series all around Figma automation. In the first video, I showed you how to build a simple workflow in Make that will allow you to export your Figma files and save them to Google Drive. We also went into a lot more details around the different API calls used. So if you haven't yet and you're interested, be sure to check that. There should be a link appearing on screen now, and I'll also leave a link in the description below. All right, guys, if you're still here, I guess that means you're committed. You want to build this out together. So the way we're going to get started, in the description below, you'll find a link where you can download these 4, let's say downloadables or resources. What these are, so 3 of them are make.com blueprints. So these are the automations that we'll be setting up in Make, and I'll walk you through step by step how to import these and also how to configure the scenarios after you've imported them. And then we also have one Airtable automation script. So these are the 4 things you'll need as we build this out together. So make sure maybe pause the video and head to the description below and make sure you've had all of these downloaded. Now, once you've downloaded those blueprints, I want you to head over to your make.com account, and we're going to create a new scenario. Now, if you are new, you've never used Make before, there's also a link in the description below where you can, it's a special link which gives you 1 month free access to their Pro plan, and you don't even need a credit card. So use that one, sign up for free, and then you can keep going with the build. So once you've created your new scenario, at the bottom here in the bar, I want you to click on More and then Import Blueprint. And then we're gonna just choose the blueprint JSON file, which is the 001. So this first one, sync Figma to Airtable. So let me open that one up and hit save. And now you'll see that basically the first scenario has now been automatically imported for you. So this is all set up. One thing to note, whenever you're importing a blueprint, go through wherever there is a module here that requires a connection, just make sure that that connection is set up. So go ahead and make sure your Figma is connected. This just uses the Figma authentication. So you just log in to your account, very straightforward. And also I'll make sure the Airtable one is set up. Now, the one thing that you will definitely all need to do is in our webhook module here at the start is create a new webhook. And so this is important, is this is going to give us the URL that we need to put in to the Figma webhook. So Figma knows where to send the information whenever a library is published or whenever a new component is updated or created. So I'm going to add a new webhook here, and I'll just call this one Figma library published. And you'll see why in a second why I'm using this terminology. So let me hit save. And now what basically make gives is a URL here. And this is what's known as the webhook URL. And whenever this URL receives some information, then the scenario is going to run. Now, if you are brand new to the concept of webhooks, you can basically think of webhooks like a push notification you might get on your phone. So when you receive a WhatsApp message, you instantly receive a notification. And webhooks are just the way that apps can basically tell each other when something has happened. So a Figma webhook is basically going to send to this URL whenever the file is updated. So this webhook URL, we're just going to copy this and save that for later. We need to use that in a second. But all I want to quickly show you is the couple of things we need to set up in this module, like in this scenario, to get this to work. So I've added here a set variables step, and we just need 3 bits of information. And I'll show you exactly how to find each of these. So we need a Figma file key, Figma node ID, and in the end, an Airtable endpoint path. It all sounds a bit technical, but don't worry, I'll show you how to get each of these. So first of all, on the Figma side of things, let me go back into my Figma account. And actually for this demo, I'm going to not use this apps database because I've already got this set up, but I do have another use case in mind. So I've actually jumped over to another file, and this is our YouTube assets file where we basically work on all of our YouTube thumbnails. And what I've done here is created a frame, which I've turned into a component. So this is YouTube export frame. And one thing is we often use the link to YouTube videos in our newsletter, and we need to download these thumbnails in a specific format. So these are a little bit smaller and compressed than the full size that we'd upload to YouTube. And so this one's going to be slightly different. What I'm going to do is whenever basically this parent component is updated, I want to go into the individual elements in here. So these aren't individual components, but rather they're just sort of nested inside this component frame. And to get the 2 bits of information we need, we can use the URL up here. So the file key is going to be everything that's in between the /design/ and then the name of the file. So this little ID here, that is the file key. So I can just go and copy that one over. And I'll paste this one in here to the Figma file key section. And to find the node ID of basically that like sort of parent frame where we want to export everything inside of, we just need to make sure it's selected. And again, you'll be able to get it from the URL here. So here we can see the node ID is 968-7793. For instance, if I actually just like change pages here, you'll notice that this node ID is changing. So pages have a node ID, but also individual frames. So here, if I'm on the Notion webhooks, you see that is a different ID. If I actually click out on nothing, this is actually going to give me the node ID of the page that I'm currently on. So I'll make sure that this YouTube export frame is selected and grab that node ID. And what this means that whenever I make an update to this, I'll be automatically exporting these individual thumbnails. So in Make, just go ahead and paste that node ID here into this variable, hit save. I'll show you in a second. We'll need this a little bit later on about how we fill this Airtable endpoint path. Not for now, so let's hit save. Now this is already a great time to make our first test of this scenario. I want to see is, are we successfully able to identify the node ID that we found and get all basically the thumbnails inside that YouTube export frame using this Figma API call that's been set up. But in order to test this, we need to be able to trigger this webhook. And so what we need to do now is set up the Figma webhook. We're going to give Figma this URL and say, hey, whenever that YouTube export frame is published, I want you to send this information to the webhook. So to do that, what I'm going to do is in a new tab, actually create a new make scenario. Again, here at the bottom under more, let's import another blueprint. And now we're importing blueprint number 2, which is the create Figma webhook. And now this automation, this is not something you'll need to have on and running. This is literally just one API call. You need to run this once in order to create the webhook. Now, some apps allow you to create webhooks via a user interface via their app. Figma is a bit different. You need to make an API call to create the webhook. And this is using their new V2 API. So the Figma app inside Make is only using the V1. So that's why I've given you this blueprint to make the custom API call. And we do need to configure a few things here. So starting with, I'm gonna do it from scratch to show you, we do need to add some credentials. So if I head over to the Figma developer docs, and here on the left-hand side, I've just selected Webhooks V2. And then if we take a look at endpoints, there is the post webhook. This create a new webhook, which will call the specified endpoint when the new event triggers. The only thing that I want to point out here is we'll get a hint about how we can basically name our API key. So the header that we need to give Figma is called Figma token. So I'm just going to copy this one over, and inside our make scenario, instead of API key, this one's going to be Figma token. And now I need to actually find where the API key is. And for that one, I'm going to head over to Figma. This can be in desktop or in the app. And actually I need to go back to the main menu. So I'll open that one up in a new tab. And under your profile, if you go to settings and then to security, here you will see under personal access tokens, that's where you can generate a new token. Go ahead and copy that one and basically then paste this in here. In my case, I've already done it. I'm not going to regenerate. One important thing to know is your API key. You can only have one API key at a time. So I can't see this one again. I don't want to generate a new one because I'm using this in a few different scenarios. So make sure once you generate it, add it to make and make sure that it is secure. So with your credentials set up, the two things we basically need to adjust here. So I've just got some placeholders. We need to provide when we make this API call. So first of all, the event, and this is what I mentioned before, basically in Figma, you have different options on what webhooks you want to listen to. And so here I can look in the documentation. You can have when a file is updated, when a file is deleted, when a library is published. So that's the one that we're going to be using because in my opinion, it gives us the most control. We could also make it when a file has a comment, and you could create some sort of syntax whenever you write a comment like run make scenario, then it could trigger. The thing is, you'll probably, if you're working in a big design team, have a lot more comments and a lot more file updates than you might have library publishers. So in my opinion, this one's the most efficient, and that's the one that we're going to use. So in our API call here to create the webhook, I'm using the library publish event. I now need to find my Figma team ID. And that one is if I go back to Figma, and if I'm just in the main menu here, so you see like when I'm on an individual design file, I can get the file key. But if I'm just in the Figma main menu on the profile, you see /team and then an ID. So this is the one that I want to grab. That is my team ID. Back in Make, I'm going to paste the team ID in here. And next we need to give it the webhook URL, what's known as here the endpoint. So that's where do we want Figma to send the information? Now remember, that is this webhook that we have set up in our first scenario. So I'm just going to copy this one here, going back to set this one up. So now I'm giving it the endpoint where it should send the information. And lastly, Figma give us the option to provide a passcode. And you can put here whatever you want. So I've just got a default password in. This is an extra level of security. So what you could have on basically this scenario here that is listening to the webhook, you could add a filter to make sure that the passcode is the right one. But I'm just setting, we do need to, this is mandatory, so you do need to set something, up to you whether you want to use it. So let me just save this one now, and I'm going to right click and say run this module only. And the good news is we got a status 200, which should mean the webhook was set up. So you can now see the data that, hey, this webhook is set up for the library publish method. Let's go and test this one out. So over in this first scenario, I'm going to make sure this scenario is off, and that's very important because otherwise this scenario is not like completely set up yet. And if you start publishing things in your Figma file, it will start running and probably causing some errors. But what I'm gonna do here is just right click on this one and say run this module only. And now you can see, hey, it's listening for a new event to happen. So over in Figma, let me maybe do something like just duplicate one of these elements. So I'm just gonna go into my YouTube export frame, and and I have this like last placeholder here, which allows me to create new ones very easily. I'm just gonna duplicate that. And now if I click back on this parent frame, which remember is the component, I now have the option to publish changes. And you can see here, there's other components in this sort of, in this library or in this Figma file, but by default, Figma is only gonna select the one that I'm exporting. So let me hit publish. And Figma is now publishing the library. It's gonna tell me when that's done. So that says successful. If we head back over to that make scenario, we see that that was triggered and we get access to some data. So we have here the library publish event, and it's telling us, hey, what file did this event happen on? And also the name of the file. And then we also see, for instance, the modified components, which is our YouTube frame. Now I can quickly go through how these first steps of the scenario are set up. Very important thing that I have set up here, if I can just zoom in, is this filter. Because what I'm doing here is I'm making sure that the file key that we get here basically matches the file key that we want to export from. Because if you maybe noticed when I'm creating this webhook here, what I'm not able to do is say, which file do I want to listen to? I can only say, I want you to tell me whenever a library is published in the whole team. So if you have many files, this could trigger on many different files when library is published, and we don't necessarily want these assets to be resynced. So what I've made sure here is that only when the file key equals the file key that we've set here in the variable step, do I want you to continue. So let me now just unlink this one here, and I'm gonna run the scenario, and I'll make another update to that file. What's great is I can simply go back here and delete that last element that I created, because that is technically updating the component. So I can again publish changes. I'll hit publish. Awesome, so Figma was now just informed about that change in Figma. We received the webhook telling us, hey, again, our YouTube assets library was updated, and it successfully passed the filter because those file keys matched. And now we made our first Figma API call. Now what this one is doing is basically listing out, if we take a look at the results here, we see that this is about the YouTube assets file. And we can see here in nodes, nodes is this concept of like, what frame are we currently looking at? And within this Figma export frame, we can open up this document section, and we see here in children, this is now our individual thumbnail. So you can see here, the first one is the thumbnail for my video on ChatGPT roles. Then we have on AI data. So these are now, we basically have access in Make to those different elements here inside this Figma frame. Now, before we now go and set up our Airtable base, which is a key component to this whole Figma asset management structure, I just want to quickly tell you about what these next two parts of our scenario are doing. And I think the best is there, I'm actually going to demonstrate and give you a run of them. So I'm just going to unlink between the CSV and this iterator here, and let me run this scenario again. It's probably going to give me an error because it doesn't like when this iterator is the last step. I need to go back into Figma and make a change. So let me just duplicate and publish. And we saw that that has successfully run. So I want to show you again is right now that like the data we're really interested in is sort of buried in this API response here. We see like we get body, then we have to go to nodes. Then this is going to be the specific ID that we set here as the node ID, then document, and then children. What we want to do eventually is loop through all of these items and sync them to our Airtable base. So in order for us to do that, I do a little bit of data manipulation here, but don't worry, like all of this is already set up for you in the blueprint. And then what that means is this iterator, we need to give it an array. And thanks to this manipulation, what it's able to do is basically now it's looping through all of those child elements. So you can see here back in my Figma file, we have these child elements. So the YouTube thumb number 1, then it's the next one's called AI data, then it's OpenAI 12 days. These are my different YouTube thumbnails. And thanks to this iterator, we now have each of those in a separate bundle. And what it means is now that each of these are in a separate bundle, what we can do is use this CSV module to convert all of these to a CSV file, which is the format that Airtable's Sync API needs. So now that I've walked you through that one, we can go ahead and set up our Airtable base. So over in Airtable, I just want you to create a new base, and I'll just hit start from scratch. You can also add this as a new table to an existing base. That's totally fine. So let me call this one here YouTube assets. And Now I'm gonna add a new table, and where I'm gonna basically, instead of creating it from scratch, I'm gonna select here from the 23 more sources, and the one that I wanna use, if I scroll down, is sync API. So you will see here like CSV file. It's not what we want because we don't wanna have to manually import a CSV file. We want this to be automated. So we're gonna be using the sync API. Now we just need to basically hit set up here. It's giving us some instructions, so hit set up. And now what basically Airtable have given us is an endpoint, a specific URL, similar to like a webhook URL that we had before, but here Airtable saying, hey, whenever you send to this URL some CSV data, we're gonna actually process it and save it to this table. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna go and copy this whole path here and head back to the make scenario that I have. I'll connect this one back up. If I just open up here, and again, I'm using the make an API call. So this is a custom action from Airtable, but we're making use of like makes authentication. So I'm already authenticated here. And you'll notice that the endpoint path, I've made it dynamic, and I'm basically going to be setting it here in this first variable. But one thing that I want you to check out here is you'll see that this one, it's a relative path only. So I don't need to give the whole URL. My path should basically start with V0. So if I go into my first variable step here, and I'm gonna paste the URL that Airtable gave me, and I'm just gonna remove everything before the V0, hit save, and now let's save this and we can run this whole thing. I'll make sure that my CSV is properly mapped. So here in the CSV, I have a data structure, and I've got the node ID, parent node ID, name, and file key. So let's now run this whole thing, and I'm gonna go back into Figma and make a change. Again, I will just remove this last one, and let's publish here my export frame. So that's triggered. This is now running. It's getting basically those child elements of my frame, creating the CSV, and now pushing that to Airtable. We have green light here. Let's have a look. So status 202, it means it was successful. Let's go on back into our Airtable base. And you see now this has changed. The API request was received. So now Airtable should have the data that I just sent it. And you see here, it has that 100%. So what we can quickly do is just go and configure these. So sometimes Airtable gets a little bit creative with the field types. So actually in my case, node ID, I just want that to be single line text. Same for the parent node, single line text, the name also single line text, and the file key. And now it's asking me if any of these columns here are unique. So what is the column that will be the unique value? And in my case, I want to use this node ID, because what I know is that this node ID will never change. Even if I change the name, the node ID will stay the same. So that is really the true unique, let's say, element here. And then when we're setting up this Airtable Sync API, so first thing I want to point out is that the Airtable Sync API feature, it is a feature that's only available to business and enterprise. Really, it is one of the most compelling reasons why you would get an Airtable business license. We do use a lot. It makes everything, like moving large amounts of data around, super, super efficient. So it is only available on business. We then have a couple of options we can set here. So I can basically determine the table will automatically update when an API request is received. That's what I want. I don't want to have to manually sync this, so that's good. And then I have the option to say each attachment contains the entire data set. And so what you should determine here is, do you want, and it really depends on how you plan to use it on the Figma end, do you want to only have synced basically any component that is currently in Figma, meaning if you delete a child element, it should be deleted from Airtable. If you do, then select delete the records. So if you want, basically it's a full overwrite. Whatever is in Figma will automatically be synced one for one to what's to Airtable, means if you delete it in Figma, republish, it will be removed from Airtable. Or you can have the choice to leave the records and only add new ones. So this setting, I'm gonna leave it to delete the records because I wanna have this clean sync. We can now go and create the table. And you'll see now that that has been created. I'm gonna rename this because this should not be called node ID. So I'm gonna rename this to YouTube thumbnails and save, and let me delete this sort of first default table that was in there. Perfect. And just to test that this sync is working, so you'll notice here that I've got that like placeholder in, this YouTube thumb. But actually what I only want to have is the elements that are real YouTube video thumbnails. I don't want to use this placeholder. So what I can do is in my make scenario, I'm going to go and add here a little filter before the CSV file. I'm going to say where the name of the element that I'm currently looking at is equal to, so I'm going to say where it starts with. And let me go over to Figma, and you can see because all of these names use the same naming convention. So I'm going to say where the name starts with this. So name starts with, and the name is not equal to this. So we know that we're only going to be having real YouTube basically thumbnails added to this, and this will basically exclude that placeholder. So let me hit save, and I want to run this one again. Again, let's make a update to our Figma file. I can even just duplicate this again, because as long as I'm not changing the name here, it should not basically be pushed anymore. So I'll publish changes, and let's take a look at the automation to check that it's running. So that successfully ran, and if we head over to our Airtable base, now whatever works with this like sync API, you can wait, like after a couple of seconds this will update itself, or if you're a little bit impatient, you can just hit sync now, and you'll see that that element was removed because it was no longer in that last CSV that we sent. All right, so our sync is looking good. However, what you may notice is we haven't actually exported any images yet. All we're doing here is making an API call to Figma, getting some elements inside a frame and syncing them to our Airtable base. We now need to build the second part of our automation, which is actually gonna, for everything that gets added here, we wanna export it in the size that we want, save it to Google Drive, and also push it back here to Airtable. So for that, I'm gonna add a couple of columns here, and this is another really powerful feature of this sync API. You'll notice these columns here have all the lightning bolt. These are the synced columns, so we can't actually edit anything. However, what's amazing is we can add custom columns next to the synced data, which is super powerful. So the first thing I'm going to do is create a column called upload image. And this is going to be a single select, and I'm going to give it 3 options. So the first one is going to be trigger, then we're going to have in process, and finally complete. And this single select we're going to need to use to basically trigger our automation. So I'm going to create that one. So we have the upload image. Now I'm going to add a field to actually host the exported image. And this is going to be an attachment field that I'm just naming image. And then lastly, a very important, so that we actually know like which item has already been pushed to Google Drive or not, we're going to add a single line text field. And here I'm going to call it Google Drive file ID. So we're going to have in our second automation where that will import the blueprint, whenever any of these are set to trigger, we're going to download the image, export it, and upload it back to Airtable, upload it to Google Drive, and then we'll also save the Google Drive file ID. Here, one important thing in this single select is we want to have the default option to be trigger. That means whenever this syncs and a new file gets added, it will automatically be set to trigger. However, if something is already set, for instance, to complete, it won't change. So this is going to be a perfect way to trigger our automations. All right, so now we're going to go back to make and again create a new scenario. And this is now we are importing the final blueprint. Guys, we are almost there. Stick with me. We're almost done to setting up your full Figma asset management system. So let me import the blueprint. This will be now blueprint number 3. And let me hit save. And there is now some original configuration that we need to do. So first of all, I'm going to double check my Figma connection and make sure it's on the right one. That's good to go. Now on the Airtable side, one thing is this basically blueprint is going to be connected to that first example that I showed. So unfortunately, some of this like mapping will be removed. And you'll see here is I'm no longer using the Figma assets base, but rather that new one that I created, which is YouTube assets. So here in my scenario, I'm going to change this one to YouTube assets, and it's going to try and search for that YouTube assets. And the table that I'm going to be using is the thumbnail table, YouTube thumbnails. And now you'll see it'll automatically pick up those fields that we created, but we will need to redo the mapping, and we're going to do that in a second. And we'll need to do that for both of these modules. Lastly, in order to get this one set up, and so again, this scenario is triggered by a webhook. The way we're going to trigger this is from an Airtable automation. So Airtable automation is going to run a script, the script that you downloaded. It's going to trigger this automation, basically download the image, upload it to Google Drive, and then upload it back to Airtable. So let me add a new webhook. I'm just going to give this a name, and it's going to be Airtable Figma Asset Management Export Image. I was playing around with that one before. So let me hit save. This is the URL that we need. Now, before I go and set up the Google Drive steps and the Airtable steps, let me actually just unlink this one here. And I want to make sure that we're successfully downloading the image. So in order to trigger this, we now need to go to Airtable and set up our automation. So in Airtable, we're going to go to automations, and I'm going to set up my first automation here. I'm just going to change the name of it first of all. So I'm going to say trigger Figma image export. And the trigger is going to be when a record matches conditions. And the conditions are going to be, so I'm going to select my YouTube thumbnails table. The condition is going to be whenever that upload image single select. So let me just open up the data view in a second tab so we can see this, is whenever this one is set to trigger, I want to make sure that we're triggering this automation. So I've got this one set to trigger, and it's important that you have at least one so that Airtable can basically test out as you're building. So I'm going to say whenever the upload image is set to trigger, and now I can just say choose record, and it'll show me which records in my table have currently meet those conditions. In this case, it's only the one. Now we're just going to add an action, and the one we're going to be using is run script. Now this is JavaScript, so I know it is quite technical, can be a bit daunting, but the great news is I have the script for you ready that you can simply copy paste. So that's going to be now the last part of those 4 things you downloaded before. So I'm just going to open this one up in a text editor and just copy this script. So what this one is simply doing, I'm just going to paste this one here, is basically getting access to the different field, let's say the elements. And so I need to configure these here. So I need to add input variables. So what we need for our webhook to work, to have the data it needs, we need the record ID of the current record in Airtable. We need the node ID, the file key, the Figma name, and the Google Drive ID. So the way that works is we're just going to add variables. I'm going to make sure the name matches exactly what I've put in the script. So the record ID, I'm going to grab from the record that matched the conditions. It's record ID. I'm then going to add the Figma node ID. And this one, I will grab the record that matched conditions, and I'm going to grab the node ID. Then I'll do these for the rest, and then we can maybe fast forward a little bit. Okay, so all my input variables are set up and mapped here, and I can actually then go and test this out. But before I do that, one extra thing that's very important that we update here in our script is here I've got a little line in line 8 where we need to enter the make webhook URL. So that is going to be the webhook URL of this one that we just created, this third scenario that we've imported. Let me copy the address, and I'll go back into my Airtable automation and just paste that one in here, making sure, I think I messed up the quotes there. So all this one is doing is making a post request similar to what we did with like Figma webhooks, and just basically sending all the data we have around this record to make. So in my make scenario, I'm going to run this once, and here I can basically go and test this one out. And if we take a look at the data that got sent to make, so we see our webhook was triggered. We get the record ID, the node ID, the file key, and the Figma name. Notice we don't get a Google Drive file ID because we don't have it yet for this specific row. If we take a look at the data, this is set to trigger, but we don't yet have a Google Drive file ID. So therefore, here we're just getting the data that we do have. And what that allows us to do is go and export the image. So here we're just using the file key and the node ID, setting it to PNG and exporting it. And what this basically returns, and this is what I really go into in detail in the first video, is the URL where we basically should have our exported image. So that's looking very good. So now what I need to do is basically hook this one back up. And before I do anything else, what I'm going to do is create a new Google Drive folder where we can store these YouTube assets in. All right, so in Google Drive, I created a new folder, just named it email thumbnails. This is where I'm going to be exporting those thumbnails. And from the URL again, we can just copy everything after folders. This is the folder ID. So if I copy this one over and go back to my make scenario, so the only place where I need to update this here is in this first step. So make sure your Google Drive is connected, and I just need to update this folder ID. What's going to be great is we only need to do this in the first step, because basically here in the second one, we're updating a file, and that we're going to be doing based on the file ID. And so we don't need this folder. You only need it in this first step here. So just walking you through how this works is from Figma, we basically get a URL of the current image that we need to download. So we see here, we get this URL. What we then do is basically download the image using an HTTP get a file request. That image that we download is mapped into the Google Drive step, which uploads the image. And then lastly, what we need to do is just configure this Airtable module. So it's an update a record is the action that I'm using. The record that I want to update is the record ID that we've sent here. Then the only couple of things that I need to set up. So if I scroll down is I want to change this upload image single select to complete because it was successfully uploaded. I now want to add the image in here. So I want to add a new item. And with Airtable, it's a bit different to Google Drive is we don't upload the data. We can actually just directly use the file URL. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go into this download an image step, copy this little formula, and paste that one here into the file URL. I can give the file name that we get from our webhook. So this is the Figma name, and now my Google Drive file ID. That is going to be the ID from the step before, that file that we just uploaded to Google Drive. And that is it. What I'm actually going to do is I need to update also the Airtable call for the second path when we already have that Google Drive file ID saved. This is in the scenario that we're updating an existing image rather than a new one being created. In this step, just to walk you through, we don't need to add anything because purely it's going to get the file ID from our webhook. It has the name from the webhook and it has it from the download step. So what I can do is simply clone this one here, and I'm going to delete the one from the blueprint. And now in terms of what we need to change in this step, so again, we're just updating it based on the record ID. And I just need to make sure that this Google Drive file ID, you see here that it's linked to module 7. Module 7 is this one, it's a bit hard to see, but I can zoom in slightly. Module 7 is this one here, whereas this one here is module 11. So what I need to make sure that in the file that I'm updating is going to be from here 11, update, and it's going to be the file ID that was just updated. Everything else can stay the same. So let me hit save. Let me turn this one on. And now we have the great pleasure. Remember that, as I said, the way this one's going to work is we have our automation in Airtable. I just need to finish editing and turn this one on. This one's going to trigger as soon as this is set to trigger. And now any new asset that's going to be created is going to be by default in the field settings set to trigger. But now what I can do for the first time is just manually do this for the first 6 that we have here. So I'm just going to say here, trigger, and then drag this one down. This is now going to, if we check out our automations and we look at the automation history, we see there's a few things in progress. And if we take a look at our make scenario, let me just line this one up. And if I have a look, I need to save the changes. Okay, we got some errors. Let's take a look at what's going on. It's maybe because I didn't save it properly. So in here, what was the error that we had? Okay, invalid file name in parameter file name. Okay. So let me see, maybe I just mapped this wrongly. So we have the Figma name that should be okay. Let me see what we got from the Figma name. Okay, maybe it doesn't like the /. So what I'm going to do is just make the file name the node ID instead. So this is going to be the Figma node ID. You can also leave it blank. So let's just leave this one blank, and also here, make sure that it's blank. Awesome, save. And now what we can do is if we go back, I need to just turn this one on again and say process old data. And we can see just like that, all of them updating. We now have in Airtable, the image downloaded as an attachment. So we can see all of our YouTube thumbnails are now synced to Airtable. And we also have the Google Drive file ID. So let me go and check now in Google Drive to make sure. And here they are as well. Pretty cool that they're all already downloaded to our Google Drive. Now, really, I want you to make this attached to the use case that you have. So in my case, we use Google Drive. If this needs to be synced to Dropbox, you can just update your make scenario. If you need to save them to Notion, it's basically just adding different steps here. But having this system with Airtable will make sure that everything stays synced. Your designers can just stay working in Figma, hit the publish button, and know that then everything else is taken care of. It's going to be dynamically synced to your Figma asset management system in Airtable and then pushed to whatever tool you need. And it's going to save you a bunch of time. So I'm really interested. Is this something that you're going to set up for yourself? Let me know in the comments below. If you do have any questions on the setup, please drop them in the comments below. Definitely happy to answer those. If you did like this video, please give it a thumbs up and also subscribe to the 9X channel.